Okay, thank you everyone for joining our Tag Inspector webinar here today. We'll be going over the topic of cookies and you, so how Google's new approach to cookies affects your business. To kind of kick it off, just a little bit of housekeeping. So about Tag Inspector and myself, Lucas, that's me on the screen there. Your presenter. So Tag Inspector, we're a tag auditing and monitoring platform. We help organizations across the globe with understanding the data that's been collected across their websites, ensuring complete, accurate, and compliant data collection. A big piece of that obviously is with cookies as it relates to marketing, advertising, analytics platforms. And so we do a lot of work with organizations on auditing of cookies that are being set and really helping to make sure that the architecture around their tagging, data collection, use of cookies is up to snuff. So compliance as well as meets the needs of the organization. A little bit of context, Tag Inspector is a product of InfoTrust. On the InfoTrust side of the house, we do all things analytics consulting work. So anything with analytics, understanding user behavior on the website, all the way through to audience creation to best activate a lot of that information that you're collecting. So thousands of websites that we're working with. We do a number of these training and educational type of events, such as webinar here today. So thank you all for joining, and so we can kind of dig in. First thing, just a quick disclaimer. One of the things that we'll be talking about here as it relates to cookies, especially in the overview, is just some of the laws and regulations that you need to keep in mind just with the use of cookies. And then we'll dig into the technical aspects, specifically around some of Google and Chrome's new updates with respect to cookies. As far as the agenda, we'll start out with just an overview on cookies. It might be a little basic, I guess, for some folks on here, but one of the things that I constantly come across in discussions with the different organizations is confusion around the difference between cookies and tags and how exactly those fall into the ecosystem. So we'll go through just a very high level what cookies are, how exactly they're working, some of those different attributes that are specifically referenced and dealt with for some of the different browser updates and technical limitations that you're going to be facing with cookies here moving forward. We'll then get in specifically to the Google cookie announcements. So that's going to be both the most recent Chrome updates with respect to how different cookies and different types of cookies need to be labeled in order to be accessible in users' browsers, as well as we'll dig into some of the more recent news from the past month, Google's announcements around trying to phase out third-party cookies over the next couple of years. We'll then dig into some practical implications and then wrap it up with the summary and Q&A. As always, if you have questions just as we're going through, please drop them into the questions pane. You should find that within the GoToWebinar little control panel that you have there. I'm happy to dig into questions, make this a little bit more of a discussion as we're going through. So anything that comes up, drop your questions in the questions pane, and I'll try to get to them, as we're just walking through everything. But then anything else that we need to clean up, we can go through there at the end within that Q&A. Expect to have plenty of time for that. I know a webinar here is scheduled for about an hour. Probably wrap up a little bit before then. First, to quickly address, I know one of the common questions that we always get, will the recording and the slides be made available? Yes, those will be sent out to all of you that have attended here today, and then also will be accessible through the Tag Inspector website. Cool. So now that housekeeping is kind of wrapped up, let's dig right in. So to start out with the cookies overview, so just really high level. So what are cookies? So cookies are little text files that are going to get placed on a user's browser, used for a number of different purposes, but you can think of them just as a mechanism that platforms are using to store information about a user. So oftentimes it might be preferences that a user is selecting on your website, or information about ads that they have viewed, or information about the ads that they're clicking through in order to get to your website. And then what happens is different scripts and different platforms that are loading on your site will use those cookies for different purposes. If it's like a unique anonymous ID, maybe it is to tie together user sessions across different websites or different experiences within your ecosystem. Cookies are also used for personalization purposes. Maybe you have specific landing pages geared towards individuals' past browsing behavior. So cookies and information stored within those could be used for that purposes to be able to serve a more personalized experience. Also used to, again, tie together user actions across multiple different interactions with your various digital properties, be that advertisements out there just generally across the web or past experience or interactions with your website. So that information gets saved there in cookies. And in addition to just the cookie name and the values, which is going to contain all that information that I was just mentioning, there are a few additional attributes. And it's important, I'm just going to pull up on our InfoTrust website here a list of cookies that are set here on the home page. These attributes, and this gets a little bit low level, but it's really important as we will go through some of the more recent Chrome updates and even some of the updates around ITP, ETP. These are the things that are being kind of addressed there. So the common attributes that you're going to see, the name, that's just the name of the cookie, the value, that's what is going to be storing those things like a unique anonymous cookie ID or those user preferences or even consent preferences, for example. The domain, that's the domain that the cookies are set on. So when we talk about first party, third party cookies, first party is going to be anything that's set on the domain of the actual website. Third party are going to be these cookies that are set on like Google, DoubleClick, Facebook domains. You have it expires, so that's just the expiry date of your cookie size. And then the things that are going to be referenced here when we go through some of the Chrome updates that are made are these attributes here. So HTTP only, and then specifically secure, and then same site. And we'll get into what those values can be, and then how those are going to be treated here with some of these more recent updates. So that is what cookies are. How those are being set, and one thing that's a really important differentiation that needs to be made. Oftentimes when we're talking about web analytics, advertising, marketing technologies, we use the terms tags and then also cookies. And they're often within, especially just marketing teams, in organization, there seems to be some confusion between the two, I guess, distinctions. So tags are what's like highlighted here in this slide. This is a script or a tag for Google Tag Manager. What a tag is a piece of JavaScript code that's going to run on your website. Now, these are responsible for setting cookies as well as accessing cookies for the various different types of use cases like I had mentioned. So tags run, they're responsible for collecting information, they're responsible for accessing cookies and then setting cookies. But the cookie itself is, again, just that text file that's going to be placed on your user's browser. So here's a quick and dirty visual here. When a web page is loaded, tag runs, it goes out, requests information, loads it in. In this case, for Google Tag Manager, it's going to load in all the other tags on the website. It's also going to access cookies that are placed on the browser in order to be able to package that up and send those with requests to things like analytics, your media platforms for that tracking attribution purposes. And then it might also be, a tag might also be setting a new cookie on the browser and with like a unique anonymous ID or some preference that a user is selecting on your website as they're going through that experience. There's two different ways. So that's with a tag, that's one means of setting a cookie. Another way that a cookie can be set is via the actual header response of the page itself. And that's important, not necessarily for the Chrome updates, but for the ITP updates, is that first-party cookies set via those header responses do not have the same restrictions as first-party cookies that are set via JavaScript, such as a tag on a page. If you want some more kind of nitty-gritty details on the ITP, those types of updates, we have some past content on that. Again, it's just accessible there on the Tag Inspector website that gets into that a little bit deeper. But today, as mentioned, we'll be focusing more on the Google and the Chrome updates. So those are cookies, what they are, how they work. Hopefully that's clear, and hopefully it gives us all kind of a baseline of understanding as we move forward and we discuss some of the different implications for some of these different technical protections around cookies and different restrictions and rules that you need to play by. Now, one thing before we get into those different technical requirements, another main or really big restriction on the use of cookies is privacy legislation. So the primary ones that you are going to need to keep in mind are, if you're doing any business within the EU, the e-privacy directives, or what they could consider or call shorthand the cookie laws. Now, these are going to be specific by country, but there's a general directive across the EU. As you can see here, that it's important that users have more visibility into the information being collected about them, as well as the use of cookies or any type of trackers. And it's up to the individual countries, and it's mandated that individual countries put in their own laws and requirements around the use of these types of technologies. A few just requirement examples here. As mentioned, it is country specific at this time. They're still working on a general e-privacy regulation that is meant to codify these requirements across all of the different European member states. But just a few examples here. In the UK, consent requirements for the use and the placement as well as the accessing of cookies is tied up very closely with the definition of consent under GDPR. So any use of cookies requires consent that must be explicit, unambiguous positive action for the placement or the accessing of cookies within the UK. So keep consent in mind for those users. Germany, they have a very similar requirement to the UK, following what many of you maybe have seen or heard about, the Planet 49 decision, where it really tied the definition of consent for the placement and use of cookies to that of as defined under GDPR, which again is that unambiguous positive action as well as an ability to opt out. I want to just give a very high level overview here of these different requirements, just because it relates to how we can use cookies. For more specific information, again, on this, we do a deep dive in a few past webinars and past things that we've put out. You can access all of that content also on the Tag Inspector website if you have more questions or curiosities on the legal requirements around privacy and compliance as it pertains to cookies. So moving beyond just those legal requirements, which is basically within the EU, you need consent. The definition of consent is going to vary a little bit based upon the individual country for the use of those cookies. And that was really the first wave, right? So those were the first the first rules put in place around the use of cookies. Now, as users became a little bit more attuned to privacy considerations and how tracking was happening with their information, and those laws and the regulations were not always upheld to the standard that was the original intent, we're now starting to see these technical restrictions imposed by browsers themselves. So the first ones here, and again, just to give a high level overview, were the ITP considerations. This is Apple's Intelligent Tracking Prevention. Mozilla has ETP, which is Enhanced Tracking Prevention, which is very similar to how Apple is handling these cookies within the Safari browser. Here on this slide, we have just an overview of the two most recent updates. The big one there and kind of the current state is at 2.2. So persistent cookies set through document.cookie are capped to 1 day of storage when both of the following conditions are met. These are going to be first-party cookies that are set via JavaScript. Anytime there's cross-site tracking capabilities responsible for navigating the user to the current web page, and then whenever a final URL has a query string and or a fragment identifier. So what this is meaning is that even a cookie set in a first-party context, when these conditions are met, is going to have a much shorter, the expiration of that cookie expiry is going to be capped at 1 day. This has implications for marketing and mostly around analytics that you might be running on your website. For things like users coming in via advertising campaigns, especially the common way of tracking those within your analytics platform is going to be through those query string parameters. And then also, oftentimes, obviously, a user is going to be accessing your website via an ad, which falls under those domains classified for those cross-site tracking capabilities. It makes attribution and to that nature much more difficult. We'll get into some of those more practical implications in some of the ways that you can really start thinking about addressing those a little bit later here, but it's good to know exactly what those restrictions are. Now, in addition to those implications for the first-party cookies, also for third-party cookies, it basically just cuts those out. They're not really accessible outside of the session in which they are there. So the purpose of a third-party cookie or a context or a cookie in a third-party context is going to be so that that could be read across different domains, across different sessions, across different websites, across the web. And ITP effectively puts an end to that, makes it not possible. So those were the first technical kind of implementations, and everyone, there obviously it's a concern, but at the same time, the majority of users across the web are using Chrome, which is where the new, more recent announcements and updates put forth by Google really come into play. And that's what we really want to focus on here today. So let's first just go over exactly what these are. So the first one is a technical limitation. So in the Chrome 80 updates, and originally this was announced to be going live on the 4th of February. That was pushed back a little bit, and as of now, it's rolling out this week. So the week of February 17th, 2020. These updates are going to be rolling out across updated Google Chrome browsers. And what this change is, and what this update is that it changes the default cookie behavior. So when we were looking at the InfoTrust website shortly before, I showed you those two different attributes that are associated with a cookie, one of them being same site, another one being secure. So what the Chrome 80 update does is that by default, that same site parameter, if not defined when the cookie is being placed, is going to be set to lax. Now, as far as the values that a same site attribute can be, there's 3. The first one is going to be strict. When same site equals strict, it means that only cookies that are set on the domain of that website or within the browser bar of the user, so that site can be site domain, that cookie can only be accessed from that particular domain. So it's going to be a strict same site or strict first party cookie. The second attribute here, and what Chrome is now setting that same site attribute to be equal to when it is undefined, which is the vast majority of the time, is going to be lax. Now what this means is that strict behavior is accessible, plus cookies that are set on the domain or the site being navigated to will also be accessible. So this comes into play with a first-party cookie. Say a user clicks through on an advertisement that you have somewhere else on the web, some media, so a display ad. At the time of that click, or say that click through metric, I guess, that would be being collected there. So a cookie would be set at that point. The user is still technically at that point on a different domain. As long as that cookie there is being set on the domain being navigated to, or within that response from that particular page being navigated to, it would still be accessible when that same site equals lax parameter is set. And that, again, is the default behavior. Now, where the kind of restriction comes in place, not much changes, I guess, for those first party cookies. The big change here is with how it is going to be combating third party cookies. So the third value that that same site attribute can be set to is same site equals none. This would be if you have a third party cookie on your that is needing to be set and then needing to be accessed. That same site attribute would need to be equal to none. So that's your traditional third-party cookie context. Cookies that are set with that same site equals none can be set on any domain and then accessed from any domain. So what this means in the update here is that if you are setting, or any of your vendors are setting a third-party cookie that needs to be accessed when a user is on your particular domain or across other domains. So the domain of the cookie does not match the domain of the actual website. It's in that context that same site equals none that needs to be defined when the cookie is being set, so that those attributes are present there, saying that, hey, it's okay to access this particular cookie with this particular domain. In addition to that, an additional attribute just noting that it is secure also needs to be set. And what that is doing is just restricting that the only way to access that cookie is via a secure request, a secure response. Let me show you, I know it's a little complicated there. Let me show you an example. Again, back on the InfoTrust homepage here. So what we're talking about here are these last two parameters. So all of these cookies here that are being set on this particular page, I have my domain. So let's look at something that's in a third-party context. So this cookie here that's being set for YouTube. So login info is the name of the cookie. Value is some unique anonymous identifier. It's being set on that YouTube domain. So this would be a third-party cookie. In order for this cookie to be accessed by a YouTube script that's running on our InfoTrust domain, because this does not match the domain on which the cookie is set, it is going to need that same site attribute to be defined and for that to equal none, and then also for that secure attribute to be set. Now I can see that is the case here. Obviously, Google's updates taking care of their own platforms. If this same site was not defined, so in this case for this ads that linked in this particular cookie, same site here is not being defined within that by that script when that cookie is being set. So this is going to be treated as lax. This would not be accessible with the new Chrome update from this the InfoTrust domain here. And that's really the big update. So the implication here is that any third-party cookie context, so if you're using, again, any type of a third-party vendor, or you're setting potentially third-party cookies yourselves on the page, they need those attributes to be set. Same site equals none, and then the secure attribute to be defined when setting that cookie, so that they have those values, so that they can then be accessed from those other third-party domains on your particular web page. So that's the first announcement. Again, we'll get into some of the implications here shortly. The second announcement that caused quite the stir, especially in the advertising, marketing, media, was what kind of is affectionately called the death of the cookie announcement. So back in the second week of January, there was a blog post put out by the director of Chrome engineering team, and it was announced that they were aiming to phase out the use of third-party cookies within 2 years, with the goal being to create a new set of privacy-focused open web standards. Now, a lot of the commentary around this was that cookies are dead. There's no more use of cookies or anything like that. That's not what's being stated here. It's just stating that they're phasing out the use, or their goal is to phase out the use of third-party cookies being used across the web within 2 years. So it's important here, and I have it highlighted, the sky is not falling. So when we think about the use of cookies and we're thinking about first party, third party, for things like analytics, for things like tracking purposes, so Google Analytics, your Adobe Analytics, the cookies that are being set there are going to be first party cookies. Those are not kind of, I mean, I'm sure there will be some implications, just as ITP changes have some implications for first party cookies, but those are not the primary target here. The goal here, and with all of these different technical measures being taken by various different browsers, is to adhere to more strict privacy standards for individuals. So giving users back control, limiting the ability to track users across the web by different platforms that are out there, and then aggregation of that information for really, specific personalized targeting that many users are starting to feel is a little too creepy. So first party cookies for purposes of the analytics, tracking, and all of that, not really wrapped up within this. Now, the third party cookies, it's important to note, and this comes directly from that blog post, will be phased out once these approaches have addressed the needs of users, publishers, and advertisers, and they've developed the tools to mitigate workarounds. So the huge concern with the death of the third-party cookie or the phasing out of that is that for advertising purposes, when you're creating audiences, say, of users, and you need to be able to target those users across other domains, if you're an advertiser, wanting to target specific users across different publishers' websites, or getting to them where they are, that becomes very difficult, and really not in a one-to-one type of relationship like it has been possible. Not really possible without the use of some sort of unique anonymous identifier that today it has been traditionally a third-party cookie ID contained within those various different third-party cookies. So the key, I guess, point here is that other solutions are being explored and will continue to be explored, and they do not plan on phasing out support for third-party cookies until the needs of advertisers, publishers, as well as users are addressed. So some new mechanism for being able to still advertise to users while giving users a little bit more control over their privacy and the ability to track them across the web. As far as the stated goals for what is being focused on here, is the goal is first to address conversion measurement, which is a big one. So attribution is very significantly impacted by these different cookie restrictions, because it becomes very, very difficult to even track an individual user, across different impressions where they've maybe viewed different ads that you have across the web, as well as where they flick through and maybe they convert in a later session. That multi-touch attribution is really made possible by being able to identify a user in all of those different venues. So the first goal here with the restrictions on the third-party cookies is to address conversion measurement, and then following that to address personalization and making sure that personalization is still possible within your kind of web environment for users. even without the traditional use of third-party cookies as mentioned here. So those are the two big Google announcements. One, the more technical announcement around the same sites and the secure attributes. And then the second one, more of a theoretical or goal announcement of the phasing out of third-party cookies more broadly. So with that, let's just kind of go through and discuss some of the practical implications that we have here. So as far as the current implications, so number one, as we went through the same site updates and what exactly those are and what they mean as it relates to Chrome, it's primarily, and I've gotten a ton of questions over the past few months from different partners that we're working with. It's primarily a vendor concern. So most of those third-party cookies that are, you're kind of indirectly leveraging via the different technologies and marketing advertising platforms that your organization is working in, the actual scripts for those, the actual mechanisms for setting of the cookies, the scripts that are running within their tags that are setting the cookies, and what you're implementing on your website to set and access those cookies is done by those third parties. So it's primarily a vendor concern, just in that if they are using a party in that third party context or a cookie in that third party context and need to be able to access the value and access that cookie across different domains, that those attributes need to be updated when that cookie is being placed. So that the cookie on the user's browser contains that same site equals none and secure parameters. If they are not setting those, then again, by default, Chrome will be treating those as that same site equals lax, and it's going to greatly reduce or inhibit the ability for those cookies to be accessed. Therefore, functionality is going to really fall apart for anything that's reliant on the reading of those across different domains. The second kind of implication related to those technical measures, again, is that ITP and the ETP impact on cookies being set. Now, these are much, much stricter, I guess, than, well, not I guess, for sure, than the Chrome updates. So the Chrome updates is just making sure that third-party cookies are properly labeled and they're being treated secure, which reduces some different security risks for users and some different attacks that can be done. The ITP and the ETP impact is that those basically cut off or throw out third-party cookies, or greatly inhibit the use of those. Now, one of the points that Google has made with the different updates and the announcements that they've been making is that this nuclear option of blocking third-party cookies by default, they view it as being able to have unintended consequences that Google has stated they're trying to avoid. So one of the things, again, from that blog post from the lead Chrome engineer there, is by undermining the business model of any ad-supported websites, blunt approaches to cookies, encouraging the use of opaque technologies such as fingerprinting, an invasive workaround to replace cookies, which can actually reduce user privacy and control. So by just strictly cutting off third-party cookies, which is why there's that 2-year kind of lead up and the need of an introduction of some new method of being able to accomplish these goals and accomplish the needs of users, advertisers, as well as publishers. That's why that's there, as opposed to taking that ITP, ETP approach of just cutting off third-party cookies. Because the concern is that new, nefarious, and even more difficult to for a user to understand or track means of identification will then be introduced, which we're starting to see a little bit. We'll talk about it here a little bit shortly. So what can we do currently in order to understand what are the platforms that might be impacted on our website, and who are the potential partners that we need to reach out to say, hey, are you updating your cookies? And just to make sure that you can maintain the current functionality that you now enjoy. So one of those things is a cookie audit. Now, a cookie audit, this is just a screenshot from our Tag Inspector platform, which is one means of being able to go about and do this. Another way, as I showed you before, you can access all the cookies that are being set within your browser on a given page. So you could even test that just manually on your website. But if you're looking for a holistic kind of an output, this is another method. So within the Tag Inspector, the cookies reporting here, we'll go through, we scan all pages of the website, we're collecting and grabbing all the cookies that are being set, and then we'll display that within a report. So for an audit, regardless of how you're collecting this information, what it allows you to do is go through and understand all those different cookies that are being set. You can do that across various different consent types of scenarios. Now, the technical measures here being employed by the browsers are going to always be employed. For consent purposes, kind of going back to some of those legislative requirements, in those different markets, it requires consent for the placement or the accessing of cookies. So before you even get to this type of an audit where you're looking at what are the maybe technical limitations that you might be facing, you want to make sure that your use of cookies more broadly is compliant with the various different laws and regulations and rules that are in place for the various different markets that you're working in. So regardless of if before you even set a third-party cookie or you define those parameters for same site and secure, you're going to want to make sure that those cookies are only being placed following a user's consent, again, within those various different markets. But once you get beyond that, you can then, again, for auditing purposes, see what are the platforms that you're working with that are utilizing cookies, in what context, are they first party, third party, and then making sure that those various different parameters are properly being defined with the cookies as they're being set. Again, seeing this, there's not much that can be done on your site standpoint. It's not something like your devs need to go in and update these as it relates to the third parties that you might be working with. It's going to be an update on their side, but doing this type of an audit can make sure that any updates have been successfully rolled out to your particular instance of their tag and their configuration of those different tools. Something you definitely want to check. Also, with a cookie audit, you can just understand, even for ITP and ETP purposes, what are the first party, third party cookies that are being placed. Again, associating those back with the platforms that are responsible for setting those. So you can understand where are some functionality limitations or implications for how you're using tools, how those might be in play given these different technical restrictions. So that's kind of how you can assess your current environment and what you can do today as far as the implications and what you can update there for these. The more broader implications of a lot of these changes is for future. So one thing, I guess, that we're hearing quite a bit, and that's kind of popping up, are some of those invasive workarounds to the replacement of cookies. So a lot of people are asking about practices like fingerprinting, which is, as opposed to setting some sort of a unique anonymous ID within a cookie that can be read, grabbing a lot of different data points from a user's browser in order to then be able to pretty accurately identify who or identify that particular browser and using an ID sort of in that sense. Now, that's a technical workaround, again, that these different browsers and these different organizations are actively working on making more difficult, and it doesn't solve this problem. There's no real technical solution to sidestep this that is going to be a sustainable solution until the industry really comes together on exactly what that method is, which is what's being worked on here in that 2-year lead up to that goal of the kind of killing off of third-party cookies more broadly. So it really comes down to, for future implications, a strategic shift in how you're thinking about both marketing as well as advertising and even the tracking. So the real areas here and what you would need to examine for how your organization and the platforms that you're using, how they're relying on cookies and what you're doing. So the first area is, I just have it called programmatic targeting in here, but even just targeting of various different audiences for advertising and media purposes. Many platforms now, as mentioned, will use that unique anonymous ID that is contained there within the third-party cookies in order to, one, develop a profile for that user. So if you're leveraging third-party data, it's probably, well, it is pulling different data points from that user for different websites they've gone to, things that they've viewed, to create that profile, and then you're able to target that specific ID specifically when you're running different campaigns. Without the use or the ability to use third-party cookies, that becomes not possible with just how, or very, very difficult with how the technology is working today. So one of the things to really think about is how you're leveraging that type of targeting, making sure that you're working with vendors that are really on the forefront of how they are going about that, how they're thinking about that targeting, but also going back and revisiting some more classic methods such as contextual advertising and really understanding and putting that emphasis on first-party data. It takes a really intimate understanding of who your users are, who are the highest value users that you have for your organization, and then being able to then understand and find them in, where they are. So it's a little bit more of an emphasis on analysis, really leveraging your first party data to understand, again, who are those high value users, and then being able to target them based upon information that you're able to glean from your first party data set. The second area here where really we need to be thinking about for the future is around attribution. So one of the big areas, as mentioned, where third-party cookies come into play is with that multi-touch attribution. And even first-party cookies with respect to the ITP and the ETP updates, those restrictions for the expiry of those various different cookies. It makes it very difficult to track users across across sessions over or visits to your websites or digital properties over a longer period of time. So being able to assess the effectiveness of just a branding campaign where you might be just getting different impressions and really priming the audience through to certain channels where you're getting that initial interest and kind of browsing of the website, all the way through to those last click types of campaigns that are leading to conversions. It becomes more difficult to do that with these different limitations, technical limitations that browsers are imposing. So really looking at, again, your first party data set, using what you have now, developing some of your own more statistically driven models in order to be able to accomplish that type of attribution that is really necessary to be a data-driven organization and think about optimizing that media spend. The final piece here to really think about kind of for the future, again, is with analysis and reporting. And again, it goes back to that emphasis on the first party data. So even for internally identifying users, you need them to identify themselves, basically. So things like logins, registrations, being able to use and leverage your own internal user IDs, as opposed to these unique anonymous identifiers that are being set within cookies, becomes a much, much bigger point of emphasis and a strategic advantage as it relates to the analysis and the reporting and just the analytics that you're running on your website. So thinking about those types of things with respect to campaigns, the marketing that you're doing, goals of your website, where you're really driving users within that funnel across your digital properties is going to be key moving forward. It's also really important important. And one thing I want everyone to keep in mind is why these changes are being introduced. It's not to make our lives more difficult for marketers and advertisers. It's to really right the ship and give privacy, put it back into the hands of users, giving them more visibility and control over the information that they're sharing, and kind of keeping everyone honest with how we're able to leverage their information, find users, and then track them across the web in general. So as you're thinking about strategies, or you're thinking about different ways of working within this new paradigm, it's important to keep privacy front of mind and really use that privacy by design type of thinking as we're thinking through marketing, advertising, and analytics strategy. Final thing here that's really important is just staying in the know. These updates are happening constantly. As we saw with the ITP, ETP slide there, there were 2 different updates last year for ITP that are happening. The Chrome updates obviously just recently came out, but that 2-year period where they're trying to update and limit that use of third-party cookies. So staying up to date on what's going on. There's a number of really good resources out there, as well as even the privacy legislations and how those are evolving. Different court cases coming up in the EU, which is changing how the definition of consent is being interpreted. So really needing to stay on top of that to make sure that you're able to maintain and really thrive within the new environment. Perfect. So with that, we can get into kind of a little bit of a Q&A. Just to quickly summarize, we went through first what cookies are, how they work, some of the different implications for those. We went through the more recent Chrome announcements, so the technical announcements and the technical limitations that are being introduced by Google, as well as the more theoretical, philosophical updates with the removal or the killing of the third-party cookie over the next couple of years, as well as some of the practical limitations or implications for those. So with that, let's hop into a few questions. So the first one here, so if we have a Facebook feed or Twitter feed, would need to be updated with a secure request. Not sure what you mean here in terms of a feed, but yeah, I mean, Facebook, if you have like a Facebook pixel or a Twitter advertising pixel on your website, that those set cookies for purposes of audience creation and targeting, those would need to be updated. But again, that's not going to be something that you can update or that you need to update within the script. That's going to be on the vendor side. They would be updating those for the methods via which the scripts that are being used to set those cookies. Question of what was the same site default prior to the Chrome 80 update? It's a good question. Same site was introduced a couple of years ago. Most people were not kind of, I guess, adhering to that. Really, the big update here isn't necessarily just what that default value is that it's actually being kind of used, I guess. Before, it didn't really matter. Browsers were just handling first party, third party, how, in kind of a traditional fashion. That same site was something that was introduced for security purposes. Now it's being more so referenced and looked at by Chrome in order for those cookies to be accessible. Are the secure and same site values being set by the JavaScript tags in GTM? So yeah, the secure and same site values are going to be set with the actual script there that's running to set the cookies. So if it's running via JavaScript to be like a cookie.write or document.cookie, it's a specific function call that is being used to actually set the cookie. It's within that function call is where those attributes are being set. So if you have tags that are running via GTM, those tags that you have, it's just going to be a JavaScript file. Those JavaScript files are going to go out, request, and then pull down and download the full tag configuration. within that full tag configuration is going to be those scripts that are responsible for setting the cookies, and it's going to be within those where those actual attributes are going to be defined. Question here, the same site cookie flag is for ad tech vendors only? Not necessarily. Primarily, yes. It's going to need to be used by any vendor or any for any cookie that for which you want to access that cookie across domains. There are some cases where even like on your own website, if you're tracking, maybe you have an organization, you have multiple websites, and for analytics purposes, you're trying to track users across each of those different domains, so cross-domain tracking. In those cases, if there is a cookie that needs to be read across those different domains, that would kind of by its very nature be a third-party cookie. So in that type of a scenario, you would also need to be setting that same site equals none and secure attributes in order for that cookie to be accessible across those different domains, even within your own organization. But yes, absolutely, for the vast majority of these cases, let's say 90, 95%, it is going to be something that would be more on the ad tech vendor side, just because those are the platforms that are most prevalently using third-party cookies. Let's see. A question here, could the Chrome 80 update have an effect on ad blocking? So if a user is using, I guess, an ad blocker on the web page, I wouldn't think so. It's a good question. I have not really come across any implications as it relates to ad blocking. The mechanism for which ad blocking typically is using is it's actually killing the requests that are being sent to those various different ad networks. It's looking for requests to certain domains that are associated with advertising platforms, and then it's killing those requests. So this update, just because it's referencing, or this update is pertaining to the cookies that would be set as a result of those requests being sent, ad blocking is going to kind of kill that before it even happens. So I don't believe that this would have any impact on ad blocking at all. Cool. So yeah, it looks like those are all the questions. There's a few others in here that are specific to individual platforms that we can kind of follow up on following the email, or sorry, following the webinar. We'll get back to you on those. But yeah, thank you all very, very much for joining. Hopefully this was helpful. As mentioned, we'll be sending out the deck as well as the recording. Let us know if you have any questions at all on any of these topics. Happy to help in any way. But thank you all very, very much. Have a great rest of the day. Have a great weekend. And we look forward to hopefully seeing you on more of these Tag Inspector educational webinars. Thank you.